Alright, it's time to do another JoJo video. So, yeah, I'm back to JoJo videos. Hooray! But, today we're going to be talking about a very interesting kind of what-if video, in my opinion. So today we're going to talk about what would happen if Jonathan did not destroy Dio's body. So in other words, what would happen if at the end of Phantom Blood, during the battle at the castle, by some miracle, Dio was able to escape Jonathan's attack, and everything just happens from then on, with Dio kind of keeping his body and all that. Well, in my honest opinion, here's how I imagine this timeline going. So buckle up, because this is going to be a crazy ride. But first, let's talk about how it would change Phantom Blood. So, we kind of go through everything in part 1, which more or less just goes the same, honestly, at that point. But the only change is that Dio, by some miracle, would not actually lose his body. I don't know how, granted, but he finds a way to avoid that from happening. So, part 1 would actually end, but the only change is that Dio would keep his body, meaning he doesn't need to go after Jonathan. So, Jonathan and Irina do get a happy wedding, with the boat not crashing, and if that's the case, that means Lisa would actually never get the chance to ever meet the Joestar family. So off the bat, she's excluded from the franchise as a whole now because of that. Now, the first part to actually change in this timeline, or like the big changes, come in once we get to like part 2. That's when changes really do start to be shown. So in this alternative universe, I really don't think Dio would really get involved with part 2 in my opinion. I just think he would probably just be hiding away and just waiting for the day to eventually go after the Joestars. But, however, a big change in this timeline, well, the first change is that Joseph would actually have a different mom. Like stated earlier, Lisa does not go through that whole boat explosion, so she lives with her parents. Whatever kind of lifestyle she lives is kind of hard to say. She probably has a good lifestyle, seeing how her parents were likely very wealthy, so she's probably living a really good life with a really rich family, I assume. I'll let you decide what her fate is after part 1. Like, in this new alternative universe, what does Lisa do now? But I do think Jonathan would maybe teach George Hamon. Now, I don't, not 100% sure, so since we don't know George's character too much, assuming George did know about Hamon but wanted nothing to do with it, if that's the case, then he's still gonna die, but maybe. It's hard to say. I do think even if George didn't want to learn it, I don't think Jonathan would force him to do it. He just doesn't seem like that kind of dad, and it just seems very out of character for someone like Jonathan to do something like that, in my opinion. But for the sake of this, we'll just assume George does live. Now, another change is, what does George's new wife like, or what's the new Joseph mom? Well, it's kind of hard to say, because at that point you'd have to be just making up a new OC for this timeline. But I do assume she maybe could learn Hamon in Lisa's place, but that's more debatable. Assuming she does, then maybe she can play some kind of role in part 2, but that's hard to say. Even if she doesn't have Hamon, I could see her actually playing some kind of role in part 2 no matter what. But in this timeline, so I guess a change would be that Joseph would actually have more family in his life. He has his grandfather, his grandmother, he's got his Uncle Speedwagon, he's got his father, and maybe he has his mother. It depends what happens to the new Joseph mom in this timeline. Now, in my opinion, Joseph would mostly be the same personality-wise, but I do think he would have some more of a noble personality, at least a little bit earlier. He would show some more of a noble personality. He'd probably get a little more noble over time, but he would show small signs of it, in my opinion. Now, I feel like a lot of changes to come out of this timeline would probably not really be too much. I don't really see Jonathan or George really affecting too much of the part during the beginning, except speeding up some stuff like the Santana arc, probably. They still meet Caesar. During the Pillarman encounter, it's possible they could kill AC/DC sooner, which in the long term may mean that Loggins could live. but I doubt it. I'm just gonna assume he still dies, since I don't really think Jonathan, George, or Caesar or Joseph really could have stopped ACDC earlier. So unfortunately, Logan still dies, but Caesar would actually survive in this timeline. Now, since Jonathan, now in this timeline, I'm gonna assume they still go to where they trained in the OG. I would assume like Jonathan and George maybe know Machina and Logan in the timeline, so that kind of would just be Jonathan and George instead. And however, I could actually see Jonathan being interested in like learning and basic. No, okay. I think Jonathan would actually go there. He and would actually help with their training, like how Lisa did. And I honestly could see Jonathan actually wanting to help Caesar because he doesn't want to see another member of the Zappelli family go. He probably would still have PTSD over Will's death. I think George would also want to help too, and in this case, Joseph would actually be more motivated to help. So with everyone actually there in this timeline, Caesar would actually be able to kill Wamu in this timeline. With more help and more experience with everyone around, this actually leads to Wamu dying a lot sooner than he did in the OG. Now, I don't think this would affect too much a battle tendency, except that in this timeline, someone else would have to go get cars in Lisa's place, and in my opinion, I think it'd probably just be Jonathan. And instead of using the scarf, he'd just use the luck pluck. Nothing much would really change, and Jonathan could just get injured, and that could motivate Joseph. Everything goes the same. Joseph versus cars. I don't really see George or Caesar playing much of a role, except they can help the Nazis against the zombies as well. But more or less, Joseph would still die, and then he crashes his funeral, revealing he's still alive. So really, everything just happens the same. The only big change is that Caesar's alive, and there's really no other changes I could really name off here. So now we talk about the next part to changes at Stardust Crusaders. Now, off the bat, you needed Dio to actually do the whole get the Joestars awakening their stand thing. So, off the bat, it's safe to assume the group just loses. Now, that is really. Now, if you want to go the route where the Joestars somehow still get a stand, I don't know how they get a stand granted, but maybe they still get a stand. The very small chance granted. Unless you could think of a cool way for the Joestars to get a stand in this timeline, tell me in the comments, but I can't really see much changing. Assuming they don't get a stand. Assuming that they do, I feel like Jonathan and George would go on the adventure. Joseph would look a lot younger, and I think Caesar would join, and I would give Caesar his whole family. So I would give him a grandson named Julius, a granddaughter named Rose, and his son would end up dying to Dio, but he dies getting stabbed by the arrow. So the Zappellis can get a stand in this timeline, which would be my excuse to put Caesar in there with a stand and put his grandkids in there with stands, etc. Now, they would still meet Jotaro, they would still meet Avdol, they'd still meet Polnareff, Kakyoin, Iggy, etc. We still get those characters here. But obviously we get like Jonathan, George, Caesar, Julius, Rose, and we get a younger Joseph. So it would be a very interesting dynamic with George and Jonathan having more of a Stardust Crusaders Joseph look, while Joseph kind of still has that battle tendency look to him, and Caesar would also have more of a battle tendency look to him. Maybe you can have Machina here, but like that's more of a maybe, and honestly, I don't really think there's a way to put him in. I mean, there's really no way for him to get a stand, and there's really nothing you could really do. Unless you want me to do unless like the whole Caesar getting a, unless like the whole Joseph's mom being a hormone master in this timeline thing, unless you want to do that, unless you want me to go that route in like comments or something, maybe I can do it. But for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna say that Machina is just not here. And in this timeline, I wouldn't really see Stardust Crusade starting off with really big changes. Like, I could see the general adventure kind of just going the same for a little bit. But I do think there would be some parts in the story where some fights would probably, like, change up. Maybe some smaller enemy battles, like against the Darby brothers, or maybe against, like, frickin' Alessi, or Steely Dan or like those kind of guys where I could see some kind of effort being made in those fights and being a little bit different. But I think a big change here in this timeline would just more or less be about the final arc, because I think that's the more important stuff. Let's kind of talk about that stuff. So, in my opinion, there's really no way to prevent it, so Avdol still dies, because there's really no way I could see that being prevented. Avdol still dies, and feel like the fight would actually have some Hamon fighters in this timeline. I can't see younger Darby taking the 4 other characters away. I mean, 5 other characters. So I feel like there's at least 1 or 2 Hamon fighters that's going to be left over. I would assume that Jonathan, Caesar, and George will put them here. Julius and Rose can be with younger Darby. And in this timeline, Iggy would live because they would most definitely have that kind of help with them. Unfortunately, there's really no way to save Avdol in this timeline. Now, for the rest of Stardust Crusaders, I can't really see too much changing, with the final fight kind of starting off with Dio going the same, but instead I would change up the split up. So I would put Jonathan and Joseph and Caesar together and actually have them go against Dio. So Kakyoin would not fight Dio in this timeline. And instead, if you're wondering who's going to be the one who sets up the trap and gets Dona and reveals the world's power, I would have it be Caesar. In my opinion, I think in this timeline, his stand could probably be an extension to his bubble ability, but could have Hermit Purple like perks to it, I guess. So I could see him setting up some kind of trap similar to how Kakyoin did with the Hamon lens and stuff. Kind of a mix between what he did against Womble in the OG and kind of similar to like the 20-meter Emerald Splash. Before it could hit, Dio stops time, and then BAM! Punches him through the abdomen, and Caesar gets sent into the water tower. Using the last of his power, he combines his blood and the water, and then hits the hands of the clock to stop the clock's hand, signifying time stop. Caesar would die there, and the rest of the final fight would more or less go the same, but I feel like Jonathan would make some kind of sacrifice at the ending to take Dio out with him, which I could see being very poetic. So, in my opinion, Avdol, Caesar, and Jonathan, those 3 would die. George, Joseph, Jotaro, Polnareff, Kakyoin, Iggy, Julius, and Rose, they all live. And that would kind of just be where Stardust Crusaders goes, with a lot more survivors. The only change is that Iggy doesn't die. Caesar would take Kakyoin's death place, and I think Jonathan would just die somewhere in the ending against Dio, in my opinion. Maybe some kind of dual sacrifice where Jotaro and Jonathan work together, but then when Dio's about to hit Jotaro or something with the last of his power, Jonathan tanks the attack so that Jotaro can kill Dio or something. I don't know, I think it'd be a worthy sacrifice. Now, the next part to change would be Part 4 / Diamond is Unbreakable. Now, in this alternative universe, since I feel like there would probably be more survivors, it is possible Joseph could maybe not do the one night stand, since Jonathan and George may get into a point where he's just noble enough where he just doesn't cheat on Suzuki for Tomoko. But let's just assume for fun, for the sake of this universe, he does cheat on Tomoko. And, I mean, not Tomoko, but Suzuki, which I still think was a terrible writing decision, but we got Josuke out of it, and we also got the Diamond is a breakable part as a whole, so I really can't complain. But anyway, for some changes, I feel like Kakyoin would actually travel with Jotaro, in my opinion, which I think would kind of fit since they're bros and all that. But no, they're not married or anything, because Kakyoin would marry Rose in this alternative universe, and I think it would play a bigger role in Part 6, but they would confirm to be married by Part 4. Now, I don't think Part 4 would really change too much, except for Kakyoin having some kind of small involvement in the beginning, like some stuff like the Josuke and Jotaro battle, or the Angelo arc, or maybe some other arcs in there. Kakyoin could kind of do some stuff there. I guess he could, like, help out against, like, Akira or something. Another change is that Kakyoin would also kind of play some kind of role against Akira as well, and I could also see Joseph and George being here around, like, the Red Hot Chili Pepper arc or something. Like, George would probably just be with Joseph during that time, which I think would make the most sense. And I feel like Rose would show up after Kira's defeat, but she wouldn't really stay too long and would probably just leave after Kira kills Shigechi. But I could see her making an appearance in like one or two arcs, like against like the whole arc with Cinderella and all that. So I guess the change is that Joseph would actually do more in this timeline for Diamond is Unbreakable, since he's definitely got a lot more energy and youth to him. George would be more like a Star Wars Crusaders Joseph at this point, but he would be a little bit crustier and older, I guess. But I still think he would at least be able to fight. Now, I don't see too much really changing, at least for most of Diamond is Unbreakable. But, however, at least the chain, like a lot of the characters who live and die, they're still gonna die and live. But I could see some other but I could see like Kakyoin playing some roles against like Sheer Heart Attack or something. But around the final half of the story, the final battle, I feel like instead of Okuyasu's fake out death, we would get George II sacrificing himself so that Josuke could live. Yeah, but however, a big change in this timeline is instead of just the fake out, George legit dies here. In this alternative universe, George would die to Lisa, not to Lisa, but to Kira, and this would kind of be the thing where that with Okuyasu around to just take out Stray Cat sooner, I feel like this would motivate Josuke enough to actually kill Kira in this timeline. So I don't think Jotaro would be the one to get the final blow, and it would be Josuke either killing Kira or injuring Kira, and maybe Rohan can use Heaven's Door to make Kira confess for his crimes. But Diamond's Unbreakable ends with Josuke getting the final blow, and George II would end up dying in the final fight. So it'd be a really kind of bittersweet ending for DIU, in my opinion. But honestly, nothing too much would really change. So now it's time to talk about the next part. JoJo Part 5, Vinta Aria, Golden Wind, whatever you want to call it. So, as for how this part would end up changing, in this alternative timeline, so a big change in this timeline would kind of be the fact that, well, a big question is like Jarno, because in this timeline, since Dio doesn't have Jonathan's body, what does come of Jarno, since, he probably wouldn't exist? Well, in my honest opinion, without Giorno, I do think Dio could still have a child, and or actually could still have children for that matter, in my opinion. So I think that whole thing with Dio would more or less just go the same. Now, I can't really see too much, I guess, really changing, but I could probably just see the fact that whatever this new kid becomes, basically our replacement of Giorno in this case, I can't really see him doing too much. So, realistically speaking, I can't really see the part really making much sense. I still think Giorno, or whoever does replace him, he could still become a JoJo in this timeline, since Dio was adopted into the family, so it still kind of fits in the story. But I don't really think too much would honestly change. Um, in my opinion, Koichi's the one who still gets sent out to Italy, since I do feel as if it would make the most sense to send him out. I know maybe send out Kakyoin because he's Jotaro's best friend, or maybe send out Rose because she is Italian, because, her grandfather Caesar. But for the sake of this, I would keep Koichi doing this, because I do kind of feel like Koichi was the best choice here. But whoever does replace Giorno, whatever their personality is, they meet Koichi. Something happens to cause them to meet, and eventually they probably fight Black Sabbath / Popo. I assume that this person would also kill Leaky Eye Luca. Bruno would still encounter them. That whole thing goes the same. And we eventually still get, everything in part 5 kind of just still happening. Now, I don't really think too much would change, at least until the ending. So, everything that's happened until then, until like Bruno becoming undead, Fugo abandoning the group because he's too scared to do anything, Bakio still being killed off, all that just goes the same. So, I guess a big change is Polnareff, I don't think, would be alone and would actually have Caesar and Iggy. I mean, not Caesar, but Julius and Iggy. Caesar's already dead. It's his grandson Julius. Now, in my opinion, Polnareff would die earlier on in the fight, and this would lead to Julius being the one who gets Requiem. In my opinion, Julius would be the one stuck inside of Coco Jumbo, and Polnareff would die. Maybe you can have it become the other way around, or maybe you could have Julius live and Polnareff be stuck in Coco Jumbo, or the other way around. Personally, I just take both out. And for Iggy, he would also die, but I would have Iggy save Narazia with his sand stuff, like the sand clones, and would use his sand to lift Narazia up in the air, kind of tricking out Diavolo, thinking he got the real Narazia. So it gives Iggy somewhat of a meaningful death by protecting Narazia. While maybe he could still die because of him being fated to die, it is possible that maybe Iggy could save him. And not only that, but in a series like JoJo, fate has kind of just been proven to be wrong sometimes to an extent. I mean, in a series like JoJo, you can't. Fate can be outdone. So I still think it's possible that Iggy could save Narazia, and I do think that it would be cool if he did. So I would personally have Narazia live, but I don't see there being any way to save Bruno, so rip Bruno. And then Giorno would still get or whoever is replacing Giorno gets the Requiem arrow. They would get reset to 0 because that would be kind of what Diavolo was the only way to beat Diavolo. So, infinite death loop time for Diavolo again. But I don't really see too much changing. At least it depends, because it could affect the story. It could depict who lives and who dies, theoretically, so it also could affect who stays, if Fugo stays as well, so in theory it's possible that maybe Misa dies and Babakio lives in this timeline, or maybe Narazia dies sooner, or maybe something like that happens. Well, I mean, who knows, but I only think like 2 members of Team Bucciarati dies, or like 3 maybe. I could see Iggy at least sacrificing himself so one of the cast can live, giving him someone of useful death. And I'd personally just have Julius inside of Coco Jumbo, and then Polnareff can actually die for good here. Kind of getting to reunite with his sister, I guess. Now it's time to kind of wrap this up. Now it's time to end off with Stone Ocean. Now, in my opinion, I think Part 6 would kind of just start off the same, so like, Jolene gets framed for the murder of the hitchhiker, all that. Jolene and Jotaro still to fight John Gallier. Jotaro loses his disc, all that. But I would have some changes. So for starters, Kakyoin and Rose have a son. Their son will be named Tenmei, and he's sent to go to Green Dolphin. And I would have Josuke, Okuyasu, Koichi, and Rohan encounter, or at least go with them. Joseph would also go along, since in this timeline he would continue his Hamo training. As he would be in his early 90s, so by then he would look more like he's probably more like in his Stardust Crusader state, so more like in his late 60s, early 70s kind of look to him. He'd look more like how he does in Part 3, if I'm being honest. So he'd not really look crusty or old or anything, and would look pretty good for his age, and would look still at least somewhat good for his age. It could still keep going. Now, as for I think the part-wise, I still think Pucci could meet Dio, but there'd be no Joestar body, I guess, to an extent. But I don't see too much of the part really changing, at least until, like, the Punishment Ward, where Hermes wouldn't be bedridden. Since I feel like Josuke could just heal her, and I'd probably just have Josuke, Okuyasu, and Koichi do the Limp Bizkit fight with Hermes instead. But I don't think too much would honestly change, except that I would have Hermes die in the Punishment Ward, and have Foo Fighters live. In this timeline, it would be a bigger sacrifice for Hermes to die here, and it gives her at least a somewhat more glorified, meaningful death here than what she canonically got. And I'd say FF definitely would have been a great choice for her to sacrifice herself to live for, so Foo Fighters can survive the Punishment Ward in this timeline. I don't really think too much would change, but I do think Foo Fighters would have enough power to both heal Anasui and keep herself alive, and I don't really think too much would honestly change in the Punishment Ward. Now, I think when we get to, like, the Dio Sons arc, in this timeline, like with Giorno, they could be replaced, or Dio may just not have kids for Part 6. And this could mean Weather Report actually survives, since there's no Donatello, meaning no one to just throw away Weather's memories and give Weather Report his memory disk. Now, in theory, it's possible that if you go the Dio Kid replacement route, then sure, maybe one of Dio's kids is like Donatello, or does something Donatello does to save their own skin, and uses Weather Report's memories as a scapegoat, like how Donatello canonically did. But I feel like in a most likely case scenario, Weather Report would live. And assuming there is another Dio kid here, I could see there being a good chance that maybe they would like to redeem said kid. Like, assuming if there's someone like a Brickell or something where they're not completely pure evil like how Ungolo or Donatello was, and they're very sympathetic and they're human. There is still a bit of that human to them. They're not monsters, and there's at least a human in there. I could see the Joestars trying to help them out, kind of redeeming a Brando, which I actually think could tell a really good story. But it's really not there, to be honest. And honestly, I could see a lot of the story kind of really changing here. I think Okuyasu could sacrifice himself to Sea Moon so that Koichi can evolve Echoes into an Act 4. And I think it would be really cool for Echoes Act 4 to finally come out. Now, I also could see Foo Fighters maybe dying here, but I think she'd most likely probably just live or something. Now, I don't see too much really changing here, except Dio's kid, if there is a kid to be redeemed. Maybe they could just die trying to fight off Made in Heaven, or maybe like FF can save them and then they're just out for the rest of the fight. I can't really say that much really changing, except maybe Dio's kid finally redeems themselves by standing up to Pucci, only to die in the process or something. But with Weather Report around, he does actually help out a lot in this fight. Now, as for Anasui, since that's kind of the next big moment, Anasui would survive Pucci's attack, since Josuke's here, and Crazy Diamond would be pretty good at healing him, since a lot of Crazy Diamond's healing was more or less something where, as long as you more or less had a will to keep on living, you could survive. And I honestly think that, like Okuyasu and Koichi, Anasui definitely had a strong enough will to survive that attack, and I think he could have held on long enough so that Josuke could have gotten to him, in my opinion. As for Jotaro, I also think he would survive, since Diver Down would still be here to tank his wounds. Now, I don't think too much would really change here, except that I feel like around the ending half, when it looks like it's all over, and when when Jotaro, it looks like he's about to die, bam, Joseph sacrifices himself, and he uses the last bit of his power so Jotaro can use the last bit of time stop and try to take out Pucci. But before Pucci could fully get away, I would have Weather Report come in and would also help out, and I'd either have Weather Report help out and weaken down Pucci so that Jotaro can kill him, or have Jotaro's time stop almost kill Pucci, but Pucci by some miracle lives long enough so that Weather Report can deal the final blow. So by this case, this would theoretically mean only Hermes, Okuyasu, and Joseph would have died. Realistically speaking, this would have meant that not we would have had Jotaro, we would have had Kakyoin, we'd have had Rose, Josuke, Koichi, Rohan, uh, Jolene, Tenmei, Weather Report, Foo Fighters, Emporio, and Anasui all surviving Stone Ocean in this timeline. So we would have gotten to see a lot more Part 6 survivors in this timeline with like only Hermes dying. So realistically speaking, 6 only ends with like 3 deaths, and then the rest of the cast actually, and then the rest of the 7 survivors would actually get to live. Well, I think it's 7, so it'd be like Hermes, Okuyasu, and Joseph that die. Then it's Jotaro, Kakyoin, Rose, Josuke, Koichi, Rohan, Jolene, Tenmei, Anasui, Porio, Weather Report, and Foo Fighters. 12 survivors. Granted, it might be a little too bloated, so maybe you'd have to trim down some characters to get to die. If I'm gonna have to say who, would probably be like maybe some kind of Morio character. Maybe someone like Kakyoin can maybe die if you want, or maybe Jotaro or someone like that can die. I personally am cool with everyone who lives here. Unless you do unless you do want to go the FF dying against Sea Moon route to kind of add at least more of a death to it, so that's kind of it for me. And that's really all I could add for this timeline. Thoughts on the video? Back on JoJo What Ifs, and I hope you enjoyed this one. So thanks for watching this one, because I honestly think this is a very interesting timeline, and it's kind of weird no one's really talked about it. So I'm going to be signing off here, and I hope you enjoyed my video. Bye.